Thank you at home for tuning in tonight. There is the urgent business of health reform to discuss tonight. Major developments today. And both Dr. Howard Dean and Roll Call's John Stanton will be here to help us with that. And a Democratic congressman flipped to the Republican Party today. The Republican response is worth asking Anna Marie Cox about. But the Cannot Wait segment of the show tonight features really inspired lip syncing that makes me believe in the future of this country. I cannot wait. I hope you will wait. It is all ahead this hour. We begin tonight, though, with the exact date and time at which hell will freeze over. You can mark it in your calendar. Hell will freeze over at 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, December 24th. Yesterday afternoon, Republican Senator John Cornyn vowed on behalf of Senate Republicans to filibuster health reform, saying, quote, "Till the bitter end, till hell freezes over, and we're skating on the ice." The bitter end, hell freezing over, skating on the ice plan was that the Senate would vote on health reform at the earliest at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Christmas Eve. With all of the intervening legislative maneuvering, the realistic timeline was actually more like 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Not only did Senate Republicans say that was perfectly fine with them, Republicans said they were willing to stay even longer than that. They were willing to stay past the bitter end.
So you'll take it right up to Christmas Eve, late Christmas Eve that evening, even though it is clear that they have the votes?
We're ready to stay to Valentine's Day if we need to.
Valentine's Day? Ha! Christmas is nothing. We will stay till February. And then today, cave. For all of their bluster about holding up this vote as long as humanly possible, Republicans decided that making the threat was much more fun than actually making good on the threat. This afternoon, Mitch McConnell, head of the Republicans in the Senate, stood rather sheepishly beside Democratic Majority Leader Harry Reid as Mr. Reid announced that Republicans had given in.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that all post-closure time be considered expired on H.R. 3590, 8 a.m. Thursday, December 24th.
8 a.m. And just like that, Republicans, it turns out, will not fight this till the bitter end. They will make sure that everything's wrapped by 8 in the morning so they can go home way before Valentine's Day, while hell is still really hot. Really, this is only a partial cave. Because if they stopped filibustering right now, this bill could pass today. The bill could pass within an hour. Democrats have the votes. It's a foregone conclusion. Even though the Republicans aren't sticking with their bluff to stretch this out through the night of Christmas Eve, they are still making it take until the morning of Christmas Eve. And how are they going to use that intervening time? Well, if the intractably anonymous Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming has anything to say about it, Republicans are apparently going to pass their time with humiliating partisan missteps that will make it into the controversies section of their Wikipedia entries no matter what else they ever do in their whole entire lives.
And there have been a number of references to our friend and colleague, the late Senator Ted Kennedy. But let's take a look about the book that his brother John Kennedy wrote, Profiles in Courage. And as we've seen all of this, it's time for one courageous Democrat to stand up and say, this is about our country. This is about our country, not about a kickback. It needs one courageous Democrat, 1 out of 60, to stand up and say, I am going to vote no. We need the kind of courage that John Kennedy wrote about in Profiles in Courage.
Have the courage to vote no on health reform, just like John F. Kennedy would have wanted you to. Wow. For the record, President John F. Kennedy not only campaigned for the presidency on health reform, he not only put health reform in the State of the Union address, he not only made addresses to the nation from the White House on health reform. In May of 1962, President Kennedy gave a speech about a little idea we now call Medicare to an overflow crowd of 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden in New York City, while 45 White House spokesmen simultaneously addressed their own rallies on health care in cities across the country. Health reform was one of John F. Kennedy's signature political issues in his ascendance to the presidency. Don't tell Senator John Barrasso. As he understands it, JFK would want Democrats to be brave and join with John Barrasso to kill health reform now. John F. Kennedy's youngest brother, Edward, a.k.a. Teddy, served in the Senate for 46 years, calling health reform the cause of his life. Ted Kennedy's widow, Vicki Kennedy, was at the Senate for the cloture vote for health reform at 1 in the morning on Monday, cheering and congratulating Democrats for having the courage, if you will, to stand together to pass health reform. Senator John Barrasso now invoking the memory of Jack Kennedy to try to convince Democrats that what John F. Kennedy would really want for them is for them to help Republicans kill this thing. Senator Barrasso, I never served with Jack Kennedy. I never knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was never a friend of mine. But I can tell, even from here, that you're no Jack Kennedy. For his part, President Obama's plan to vacation at his childhood home in Hawaii has been put off until the Senate holds its final vote.
I will not leave until my friends in the Senate have completed their work. My attitude is that if they're making these sacrifices to provide health care to all Americans, then the least I can do is to be around and provide them any encouragement and last-minute help where necessary.
That vote is now expected to happen at 8 a.m. on Christmas Eve, unless, of course, Senate Republicans decide they want to knock off a little earlier. Joining us again tonight is John Stanton. He's a reporter for Roll Call newspaper. John, it's good to have you on the show again. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here.
When we talked last night, the Republican leadership had just informed their members that they were sticking to their planning to stay till 7 p.m. on Christmas Eve. What changed between then and now?
Well, two things sort of changed. One is there's a big ice storm that's about to hit the Midwest, which is going to make travel difficult for a number of Republicans and Democrats. You have the West Coast delegations like California that are going to have to try to get home. You have folks in Kansas like Senator Brownback. They're going to try to need to go through Chicago or St. Louis on their way back home, and it's supposed to hit and snarl traffic on travel, I guess, on Christmas Eve. So that has put some pressure on them. The other thing that happened was that Senator Reid wanted to try to get out Wednesday evening. But Republicans had to stay in at least till past midnight so that they could get into the Christmas Eve, so they could technically stay in until Christmas Eve. And what ended up happening is that Senator Reid gave them an agreement to allow them to have a series of votes on a long-term debt extension in January, on January 20th, on a bunch of issues like the TARP and climate change and other things, in exchange for moving back the close-up date for this week.
I'm no expert on the comity of the Senate, comedy with a T. We talk Senate comedy with a D is more like what we usually talk about. But this Kennedy analogy struck me today as, at least it seems to me to be unusual for Republicans to keep invoking the Kennedys in their anti-health reform efforts. Ted Kennedy, of course, only died a couple of months ago, the Senate's foremost champion on health reform. Is that an unusual thing to do, given the sort of unofficial rules of the Senate?
It's a little unusual, to say the least, I think, especially since Senator Kennedy was clearly for public option and for a much broader reform plan than that's going through. Republicans have done something like this, though, similar with they've invoked votes on Social Security and on Medicare to say, well, these were all bipartisan votes, but particularly the Medicare vote, a lot of Republicans opposed that vote. So, they've sort of cherry-picked a little bit on that.
When you talked about the Republicans needing to ensure in their deal with Senator Reid that they actually stayed until Christmas Eve, why is Christmas Eve a magic date for them? Why did they think they had to stay at least until after midnight on that day?
Well, I think there's two things at play there. One is that their base has really come hard on them about trying to slow down or stop this bill, and they've been trying to demonstrate that. But also they don't, they've made a very big stink about being in until Christmas Eve at the earliest, and they felt that if they backed out of it, it would look probably sort of bad. So I think that's a big part of that.
They said they would do it, so they have to look like they're doing it.
Exactly.
In other words, what do you expect when Senate Democrats and Republicans finally get to go home to their home districts? What do you expect to see in terms of politics of health reform? Do you think we're going to see a lot of summer-style campaigning against it?
I think so. I think you'll see a fair number of town halls. You'll see the campaign committees and the RNC will be going after blue dog Democrats, moderate Democrats in the House, and then folks like Ben Nelson in the Senate, Mary Landrieu, Blanche Lincoln, anybody who they think if they can build enough pressure while they're at home talking to constituents to back out of the deal, they're going to have to go to conference with the House, and that's really that next vote, which is scheduled to happen sometime in January, is going to be their big next target. So,
and in terms of what happens with that conference committee, everybody's talking about that both in terms of it being the next thing that needs to happen happen for this to pass, but also it's the place where a lot of progressives in particular are hoping the bill is going to get better. The conference committee process is a little bit obtuse. It's a little hard to tell what's going on. Are all of the same delay tactics going to be available to Republicans during that whole conference committee process?
Well, during the conference committee process, no. Most of that will probably happen behind closed doors. It sounds like leadership in both chambers are looking to use about $20 billion. That's the difference between the House and Senate versions to try to bring in House moderates and maybe some progressives by getting them some sweeteners in their states. But once it comes out of conference and comes from the House back to the Senate, that's when you'll probably see the same sort of tactics. It won't take as long under the rules, but probably several days.
John Stanton, reporter for Roll Call newspaper, helping translate what often feels like just a big fake show. John Stanton, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Anytime.